G'day friends, it's Andrew Goodall here again from Nature's Image Photography, and after looking at wide-angle lenses in my last photography school video, now it's time to go the other way and take a look at telephoto lenses. Before we get started, I hope you'll click that subscribe button if you haven't already to keep in touch with everything from my world of photography. So what is a telephoto lens? You might remember in my last video we saw that a wide-angle lens is one that has a focal length shorter than the standard lens for your camera. Well, a telephoto lens is one with a focal length longer than the standard lens. So in case you haven't seen that video, I'd better start with an explanation of what a standard lens is. The standard lens is the one that doesn't magnify or reduce. In other words, it doesn't make things bigger or smaller. It reproduces things in roughly the same proportions as the naked eye. In terms of focal length, that can vary depending on what type of camera you have. On a full frame camera, a standard lens has a focal length of about 50mm. On the crop sensor cameras, which make up the majority of the DSLR market, a standard lens is around 35mm, and on the micro four thirds cameras, a standard lens is about 25mm. That means if you have a full frame camera like say the Canon 5D Mark IV, a telephoto lens is one that has a focal length greater than 50mm. If you have a crop sensor DSLR like say the Canon 80D or similar, then a telephoto lens has a focal length over 35mm. And if you have a micro four thirds camera like my Panasonic Lumix G9, then a telephoto lens is anything with a focal length greater than 25mm. And of course, the higher that number, the more powerful the telephoto. So that's the numbers out of the way, but what does a telephoto lens actually do? Well, if the word telephoto makes you think of a telescope, then you're on the right track, but there's more to telephoto lenses than just making things bigger. In fact, there are three main aspects I want to talk about. Let's look at the most obvious one first. Just like a telescope, the telephoto narrows down the field of view, and the narrower the angle becomes, the more objects become magnified to appear much closer than they really are. This makes a telephoto lens ideal for things like wildlife photography, where you often can't get as close as you want to your subject. And as we found out on my African tours, sometimes even if you can get close enough, it might not be such a good idea. The second factor I want to mention is depth of field. You might remember I dedicated a whole video to this subject, and one of the things that affects depth of field is the size of the lens. The larger the lens, the shallower the depth of field becomes. So telephoto lenses create a naturally shallow depth of field, meaning more often than not your photos will have a sharp subject with a soft, out-of-focus background. Now when you put these 2 points together, it's easy to see that a telephoto lens is great for isolating and focusing viewer attention on the subject. The narrow angle of view means you can't see much of the background, and what little you can see is often out of focus. So it's easy to see why, in addition to wildlife, telephoto photography can be great for flowers, portraits, a lot of sports photography, anytime you want to really focus all the attention on the subject, not just bringing it closer, but also eliminating distracting backgrounds. The third factor I want to talk about is perspective, and just like I did in my previous video about wide-angle lenses, I think it'll be easier to show a couple of examples before I try to explain it in words. Take a look at these shots of the Glasshouse Mountains. The first one was taken with a 35mm lens, which is the standard size on my Pentax DSLR. As I mentioned, it shows things in about the same proportions as the naked eye. So the fence, the tree and the mountains all appear at a realistic distance from the camera. Now I stand further back from the fence and zoom in on it with a telephoto lens, this time 80mm. Right away you can see the narrower angle and the shallower depth of field. But notice also that the tree now seems much closer to the fence than it was before, and the mountains in the background also appear much closer. The distance between the foreground and the background has appeared to shrink, and as my lens gets bigger, it shrinks even further. So here's my third point about perspective. Telephoto lenses effectively compress the distance between foreground and background objects. The result is that objects way in the distance can appear much larger and closer in proportion to the foreground object. Here I'm demonstrating the same effect on a different subject. First I stood close to Olivia using a standard lens. Notice the size of the rocky point and the buildings in the distance. Then I stood about 50 meters further away and used a telephoto lens. Notice how the background, while out of focus, now seems much bigger and closer in relation to the foreground subject. Now this is something you won't hear mentioned often, and to be honest, it's something you may not notice all that much in your photography. because thanks to that shallow depth of field, the background doesn't feature at all in many of your photos. But it's worth knowing, because sometimes this compressed perspective can open up a creative option that you won't get with a smaller lens. Here's an old shot of a supermoon event I took way back in 2012. I know that everything here is a long distance away from the camera, but we still have a foreground object, the lighthouse, and a background object, the moon. Now, if I had gone right up close to the lighthouse and shot this scene with a wide-angle lens, the lighthouse would have been nice and big, but the moon would have been a speck in the distance. By shooting the lighthouse from a few kilometres away with a 500mm lens, the compressed perspective brings the moon in much closer, making it the standout feature of the photograph. So there are the three main features I wanted to talk about with telephoto lenses. Let's do a quick recap. Telephoto lenses reduce the angle of view and enlarge the subject. They create a shallower depth of field, which is an effective way of isolating a subject by reducing distracting backgrounds. And as we just saw, they compress the distance between objects, making background objects, if you can see them at all, a much larger feature in the picture. So if you always thought that telephoto lenses just make things bigger, well, now you can see they do a lot more than that. Now I'll finish with a few more of my favourite telephoto images from my many years of photography. I hope you enjoyed the video, and for the beginners, well, I made this video for you, so I really hope you learned something. I'm Andrew Goodall of Nature's Image Photography. Thanks for watching.